Welcome to another episode of Prog Will Find a Way, your friendly neighborhood progcast. I'm Jonathan Block.
And I'm Jay Valade.
And what are we going to talk about today, Jay?
Today we are talking about 90s prog.
We
did a couple episodes ago, we did 80s prog, and we concentrated primarily on early 80s prog. And we didn't really get into the late 80s, which was kind of a renaissance of pop prog.
Yes.
But that led itself into the 90s. So we didn't. Well, maybe another episode we'll talk about the late 80s prog because it's its own kind of thing versus that early 80s post-punk prog.
Right.
The late 80s prog was something a bit different, where it was a little more polished and a little more accessible.
I concur, and I think you nailed it on the head, and then that just kind of went over that January 1st, 90 line and kind of kept going a little.
Yeah. So John and I were talking about this just prior, and during the 90s, again, I think as I stated in the 80s, I was starting to branch out more musically. I mean, I always had my fingers all over the place with different types of music that I liked, but prog was always the main thing. And then as the 90s went on, I was probably concentrating more on the bands I liked in prog rather than finding a whole bunch of new prog bands that I would follow. So I was writing a list of all these prog albums that came out through the 90s because all the usual suspects still continued to release stuff throughout the 90s. They might not have been their best or their most popular, but they did continue to release stuff. So it was still fertile ground for the mainstream prog. But John, unlike me, was trying to delve into things that he hadn't heard. So we kind of had, when we were putting our lists together of things we liked and didn't like, I had not heard most of the stuff that I mean, I had heard of, but it wasn't stuff that I would be like, oh, my favorite album from the 90s was this. I'd be like, oh, well, yeah, I heard that, but I'd never
and
jumped in.
It's hard to, it's 30 years ago.
Yeah.
It's kind of hard to imagine that 30 years ago. But yeah, I was always looking for prog and being very disappointed in the late 80s and the early 90s. I know there were bands around and whatnot. It was just it was a weird time for, you kept thinking something was going to happen and it never did. Like Marillion, it was like, oh my God, all of a sudden.
It was waiting to happen.
Yeah, right? Exactly. And oh my God, okay, Marillion, and then that just kind of petered out.
But I didn't think it did peter out to me. What happened was my wife and I both liked Marillion in the early 90s, and we would go to see them all over the place on the East Coast whenever they came to town. I mean, and then to the point of them doing their whole late 90s thing with starting crowdfunding and all that kind of thing, because they couldn't make money over here because they were just touring local clubs. We would go, and we were part of the Front Row Club, where you'd go there because it was always GA, and you'd...
I'm talking more about the effort the bands had to put in and the public perception. Nowadays, you get... Marillion can fill 2,000 to 5,000 seaters. You get a band like we talked about last time, 80s, IQ, who is really a cult niche band. They can't tour, but they can play 5 or 6 shows and fill like 4,000 or 5,000 seaters around England. You couldn't do that in the 80s or the 90s. Nobody. So I was talking more from that. I think kudos to the bands that, you could say, I'm not one of those people who's like, oh, I wish Fish had never left Marillion, because they were headed for disaster. I mean, but now we got 2 separate lines. You got Fish and you got Marillion. So, you kind of ended up getting, kind of 2 different paths and 2 different things going on there.
So, sticking on the Marillion thing, because 1990 was Fish's Wilderness Vigil. In the Wilderness of Years. And my wife and I actually were in London, and we saw him at the Hammersmith Odeon, and that was kind of fun. But that was 90. So that I don't really even think of as the 90s.
Right. It's
Prog,
the 80s. When did the 80s end? In 1991, But excuse me, and then but it's cool that that's 90, and then you think about the entire decade. Think about Marillion or Fish, like the changes and just the way the music, the amount of music that they ended up putting out in that decade is amazing.
But as you said, from a filling the seats, they went from major record labels to independent record labels to having to crowdfund and doing all this stuff, so it was the bleak years for them. And even though they had output and they were doing stuff, I don't think I'm obviously not privy to it, but I think it was probably tough for them during those times. Even I mean, when I'm wearing my Talk shirt from '94, I saw them at the New Haven Coliseum for this tour, and it was sparsely attended.
Yeah.
Which was kind of sad because they had gone through their whole union thing where they in the round with 1 million people and the whole thing. And the tour was very well attended to the Talk tour, and it was not. I went to Madison Square Garden, and that was fantastic, and they had a ton of people there, but the smaller shows were probably not as, and so that was like writing on the wall for them and then it was again sparse, lean times, I think.
And I think the bands that embraced that and kind of worked through it probably did better mentally than I think of, I saw Emerson, Lake and Palmer in 1977 at a, 12th at Civic Center, sold out. And then in 92, 93 at the Oakdale Theater, which was fine. Beautiful place to see him. I don't know how many, 2,000 people maybe. Yeah. They were happy as can be, but times obviously it changed, but it changed so much that even now people look at that from this day and say, if I could play the places like that, it would be amazing.
Which is where most of these bands are now.
Exactly.
They're in that realm of the 2,000 to 4,000 seaters of the bigger names, unless you're Genesis or whoever.
Right, yeah. I mean, somebody like Genesis, it's funny because, Genesis continued to play big places. When Crimson came back, they played the same size places they played last time. So they were always lateral, From the 70s on, they were always playing anywhere from like 2,000 to 4,000 seaters, And when they came back in the 90s, it was the same thing. So it wasn't much different for them. But we actually set ourselves a little thing, like a little, hey, what were your top 2 Prog albums of the 90s, and what were your top 2 Prog songs? In hindsight, maybe limiting it to 2 because there's a lot of down unders, and we could talk about those too. But you want to talk about your picks and why you picked them?
So I had 2. My 2 were Signify by Porcupine Tree. Album.
Okay.
And Afraid of Sunlight by Marillion. And it was kind of weird. I had to put this through the lens of what my favorites were at the time as opposed to what my favorites are now, because I really loved Afraid of Sunlight when it came out. That was their last big album on a major record label, so they were in the press, they were doing videos, they were touring, and so there was a lot of activity, and I really liked the album. I thought that it was a really good album. They were kind of stretching their legs in different kind of ways. They had the song "Afraid of Sunlight." They had 2 different versions. One a big rocking anthem kind of thing, and then one kind of this mellow, Joni Mitchell-y kind of thing. I think they refer to it as. So I thought that was really cool. And then Porcupine Tree, Signify was the first album by them that I had purchased, and I had read about them in the music press or something. And I was like, I found it at Secret Sounds, and Chris had a promo copy or something. And so I bought that, and I really liked it. It's, miles from anything that I typically, it was closer to Crimson in its darkness.
Right, yeah.
But I liked it because it was different. I mean, the way that they were sonically, it was mellow, and then it was hard, and then it was spoken word, and not them speaking, but like clips of radio broadcasts and all this kind of stuff all put together in this little package, and I thought it was really cool. But again, a band on a small record label that they switched over for their next 2 albums, to the point I didn't even know their next 2 albums came out.
Wow.
you know. And then all of a sudden I was like, oh, Porcupine Tree had 2 more albums in the 90s. It wasn't until they were on Lava in like 2001, which was a subsidiary of Atlantic, that album came out and they got all this press, and now I was all of a sudden I'm like, what happened to be? And then I found the other albums. In the meantime, I was like, well, you know, again, early days of the internet too, so it was not like you had places you could go just look stuff up, and they weren't on my radar to like follow when, because I didn't see them live or anything. They were still this band from England that I liked their album, but over the course of the 90s, I really liked that album, even though it was an outlier for me. Songs, I did Homeworld by Yes, which is 1999, so we're kind of on the edge of the 2000s.
When was Union?
Union was 91.
Okay, all right.
Right? So Union came out, and I had high hopes for that album, but I think because I was such a big fan...
Lift Me Up from that album?
It is.
Okay.
I was such a big fan of that band, I didn't feel like it came through cohesively to me. It was like this amalgamation of the Yes West Coast and the British Yes, and so there were 8 people on it plus all these session musicians, and it just didn't do anything for me. So after that, then they did the Talk album with just the 90125 lineup, which I really enjoyed that album, but it didn't
Tony
have
Kaye was on that?
Yeah.
Was he on the tour?
Yes.
Okay.
And then that broke up when I think they saw the writing on the wall. They were also on Victory Records. And that went under like the day before the album came out. It was just a disaster. And then they did these things. They got back with Rick Wakeman and Steve Howe.
Keys to Ascension.
And they did the Keys to Ascension albums, which I thought were good.
Right.
And had some nice moments, but not my favorite albums. And then they got together with, they did another album in between, Open Your Eyes. But then they got together. Rick had left the band.
So you're just going to brush right over Open Your Eyes?
It was not my favorite.
Okay.
There were a couple songs I thought were really cool.
Right over
no,
that.
there were a couple songs I thought were really cool, and they were there were some good moments on that album, but as a whole, it didn't.
Was Magnification the 90s or 2000s?
No, that was 2000.
Okay.
So
we'll get to that.
Yeah. So The Ladder comes out, and that was Billy Sherwood was in the band, Steve Howe, Chris Squire, Alan White, John Anderson, and Igor Koroshev.
Okay, he was the keyboard player.
Keyboards on it.
Okay.
And I don't know that he was a member. I'm pretty sure he was on the
currently
the
residing in where they now found.
Yeah, but they put out this album, this song called Homeworld, which they ended up using it in a video game. But I thought it harkened back to some of the best stuff in Yes that I liked from the past. So that's why I liked it as my... I think other ones that I had on my list, album-wise.
Yeah, Down Under's.
Down Unders. Well, I'm gonna just give them to you.
Sure.
It was the Songs of Distant Earth by Mike Oldfield. I thought was one of his best efforts because we did a whole thing on Tubular Bells. Yeah. But this was, I thought, one of his best albums outside of that.
I agree. The only Mike Oldfield CD I currently own. You gave that to me, actually.
Oh, did I?
Yeah, I believe you gave that to me for a birthday one year.
But it's just an album that I love.
Yeah,
by him.
I agree.
And I don't know how that fits in that time-wise, because he had a whole bunch of stuff that he was prolific. He was prolific.
Yeah, it was amazing.
He was prolific until he wasn't.
When he wanted to be prolific, he actually was very prolific.
Tons of stuff coming out.
Yeah.
So that was 94. That was just one of my favorites. So there you go.
All right.
You go.
I go. Okay, so...
wait. My other song, was The Strange Engine by Marillion from The Strange Engine.
Okay. And what do you want to say about that?
It was a sidelong concept piece about, the strange engine, the human being condition, whatever, and the story of Steve Hogarth's life, basically. It was my take on it. And it was great because it has ebbs and flows and rockin' and then mellow, and I really enjoyed that.
It's a great song.
Yeah.
The human biological machine as a transformational apparatus. All right, my tune. So I got to lay out the scene here because I've been, for me, it was like clutching at straws, ha ha ha, no pun intended, for Prog at the end of the 80s and the 90s, early 90s. So yeah, you had Fish and you had this. I said this before in Pineapple Thief. I feel the same way about some of the Porcupine. There's just this atmospheric sound, even if they were getting heavy. And then lo and behold, all of a sudden in 1993, it was really more 92, 93, Swedish Prog it exploded on the scene, essentially mainly Anglagard, but I picked Anecdoten's Vemode, which was their first album from 93, again 30 years ago. It's hard to believe. I went to a different record store, and we're going to do an episode just on record stores because we actually live in a part of the country where there were some very, very amazing record stores. So the one I went to a lot was Brass City Records. Walter, love that guy. I walked in one day and he's just like, you got to hear this thing. And he puts that on, and it was like, starts out with a little kind of cello Mellotron, and then it's just like beats you over the head. Very Crimson-y.
Oh, absolutely.
Very Crimson-y. And I would say that for me, I come from that more aggressive side of Prog. King Crimson, Van de Graaff Generator, and then you may find this interesting when I think about the continuum of aggressive prog. After that, I would put somebody like Yes, because I think Yes, you take away the Johnny Anderson voice and they can be very aggressive. Yeah. And then I would put like Genesis and then like Gentle Giant and stuff like that. But anyways, I always went for that more. So like to hear that, and also people were not using the Mellotron at that time. So that is the first time the Mellotron came back. And people kind of don't look at the Anglagard only had a couple of albums, but Anecdoten, they still have the same lineup, same four people. To this day, 30 years later, they don't put out a lot of new music, but they play shows occasionally. But I still believe they fundamentally changed where Prog went. They brought back the heaviness, and you started hearing that as the decade went on. Even Steven Wilson's album started to get harder. Everybody's albums got a little harder. They were bringing like the original keyboards back, the Mellotrons, and that's definitely from the Swedes. So if you haven't heard that album, there are points where you're like, it is so derivative. I mean, the last song, the last song, two Mellotrons playing brass come in, and it's like, it just sounds like a Crimson thing, but it's great.
Because I had not really heard it, and so you put it on. You texted me your list, and I'm like, wow, he's going out. Because I picked these very mainstream sort of things, and as far as Prog is concerned, and you picked that, and so I put it on, and I'm like, it's basically take every King Crimson album from the 70s, from Lizard on, basically, and just put them all together.
But just like you said,
which was very interesting.
But like you said, what was I thinking and what was I listening to at the time? At the time, that was like, boom, a breath of fresh air. Crimson was not around.
Right.
I mean,
None of that stuff was there
at
anymore.
That time was doing Sylvian and Fripp, more atmospheric stuff, which was great.
That's not even on my list. I love that album.
Yes.
I love that album.
Yeah.
That could be in my group here. This was my thing. I love that album.
Yes.
That album was fantastic.
So very, very heavy. So my second one is a little more, it's American, so I wanted to pick American prog band. So Echo Lynn's As the World probably holds, it was on a major label, it was on Sony. I don't know what Sony, well, I know what Sony was thinking. Well, I know what they were thinking because I believe Derek Schulman was there. And if you listen to it, their particular vocal harmonies are Gentle Giant. Now, it's interesting because when you look at American prog, there's a lot of American prog came from the Maryland, Washington, D.C. area.
Okay.
Happy the Man, and the Muffins. There's a whole bunch of bands, and someday we'll talk about American prog. But anyways, they're all informed somehow by Gentle Giant. And those guys are very Gentle Giant.
They are. And so, again, I've heard of them and probably had heard a couple songs here and there, but so I sat down to listen to that album, and we were talking about this before offline, but one of my favorite albums from the early 90s was a band called Toy Matinee, which was Patrick Leonard and Kevin Gilbert, and Guy Pratt actually is the bass player on that. Yeah. And I love that album because it's all over the place. But, it's Steely Dan, then it's, then it's Gentle Giant, then it's whoever, and they're just all over the place. And I really like it, but I really like the vocals and the harmonies. And when Ekelund starts playing that very first song, I'm like, oh, this reminds me of Toy Matinee, which I was kind of shocked after listening to the Anecdoten album. I'm like, these are two sides of the John Block coin, because they are absolute opposites. But then they go off. Do they have multiple lead singers? Because there were some singers that I really enjoyed and some that I was like, eh.
I honestly don't know. I don't. Okay. I mean, I believe they have a lead singer. They have other guys too.
When they're singing in harmony, I think that the songs are great.
And they do those twisty, turny musical Gentle Giant things too, which I like. It's just, and they cover, like you were just, they cover a lot of ground. I mean, they cover very proggy. They get very symphonic at parts. I mean, the last song, they're talking about the death of somebody, and it's just like, it's one of those kind of swelling prog afterglow, Genesis afterglow moments. I just think it's just a great album. There's something about it. Like you said, time and place. I remember when it came out. I remember reading about it, and everybody was like, prog album on. And so, hope sprang eternal, like, oh my God, what's going to happen next? And of course, nothing did, and they got dropped. And the album probably didn't do very well, but it's a point in time, and it certainly balances out my other pick, because
that's what I was saying.
Yeah.
It's like,
so there's that. For the songs I picked, by far for me the most, like, not even prog, but the pinnacle prog song for me of the 90s is IQ's Narrow Margin. So from, I think it's 95, they put out a concept album, Subterranea, which kind of goes up and down. It doesn't, but that last song is just goes through so many kind of changes. I'll be honest, the singer, Peter Nichols, sometimes I'm like, he's okay. Sometimes I don't think it fits. He wasn't in the band for some time too, but he's a founding member. He's on that. There's something about that song that, like, it's 20 minutes. It goes through a lot of different changes, but there's some parts where I'm like, it sounds like Marillion, sounds like Genesis, like they very good, and they've always been true to their path. We're totally tier 2 or tier 3 band, right? No, not a lot of people know them, but they've never changed. They've always kind of been the way they were, at least to me. They've kind of, we're prog, and we're not going to do anything different. And they've made a little career out of it. So that's that song. And then, of course, I did pick, it's not going to be mainstream, but I wanted to pick something from one of the big bands.
God forbid. This is a prog.
Well, and I will, I have my down unders that are more popular, but I picked Emerson, Lake and Palmer's Changing States from the Black Moon album. And to me, Black Moon is an encapsulation of that album of what I was feeling in a lot of that time. You'd have one or two songs surrounded by a lot of songs that I just didn't care about.
Yeah.
And that's what I felt a lot of releases around that time, which is why when the Angligard came out and the Anecdote and then the Ekelund, I'm like, oh wow, there's prog albums I can actually listen to front to back now. And but that song, that album, like you were saying about one of your picks, they totally encapsulated their classic sound. It's got the Keith Emerson keyboards all over the place. It's got the pulsating Greg Lake bass that you forget about until all of a sudden he does one of his, does one of his runs. Yeah. And it's like, oh yeah.
Oh yeah,
and,
Greg.
He's
a keyboard.
Yeah, he's
a bass player, not just a singer.
But he does those things, and it's like they just fit perfectly. So I just love that. I would always hear that song like, oh, see, they can do it. They can do it. My unders were for songs. Well, actually, for albums, Marillion.com probably would have been the next. I'm not the biggest H era. But there's something about that album I love. I think that's a great album. A lot of the other albums from the 90s I like, but not the whole album, like 3 or 4 songs. That's an album where I do put it on from start to finish. And I'm a relatively newcomer. I listened to all the new ones when they came out because you had them.
Yeah.
Radiation was the only one that stuck in my head and I would listen to over the years. And about a year ago, I was like, I want to give those 8 years a fair chance. And I listened to every single album and I would make a playlist of what I liked. And that album, I picked the whole one. Yeah. So I just love that album. There's something about that album. So that was a down under. For songs, I was really thinking of Genesis On the Shoreline, which is a B-side, didn't make We Can't Dance, but is such a Genesis kind of song. Vroom by Crimson was another one I was thinking of. And, because I spied it on your list here, you have Toll. Jethro Tull's White Innocence from Catfish Rising.
Okay.
That was like a return to the Toll prog form, and I remember always wanting to hear that. Let's not forget, internet was coming around that time, but you could not hear music. You were not. And if I was like, oh, I heard, White Innocence on the radio in 1992, how the hell am I going to hear it again, right? I would have to buy it, and I'm like, I'm not buying it just for one song. Now I feel like hearing White Innocence. I go to Apple Music and I can hear it. Right. So that's kind of my list. It's funny though, because it was the It Bites. That wasn't the 90s, was it?
That was the 80s.
That's because when you said we hadn't talked about the late 80s, we never really talked about It Bites,
right?
Because what was their second
Around
album?
the World.
Yeah, Yellow.
Yeah.
I mean, that to me was
that was
an amazing prog album, and I view that. I see like a line from that to the Echo Lynn one. Like there could have been a line, from that to really into
right. I love that album.
Another underline for me, which Fish. I looked at the Fish albums and I couldn't pick a Fish album.
I love Wilderness. But that was like 89. That single came out, and 90 came out the album probably like January or something. So I didn't really think it was truly the 90s.
So what I did, I thought about what songs do I like, and believe it or not, the song the album that had the most songs that I liked on it was Suits.
Really?
And my one song would be, and this is just totally off the wall for some reason, I love the song. It's from Suits, Pipeline. Pipeline. There's something about that song I love. That would have been a song. So as is our wont, the episode running really, really long, so we're going to split this one up into two, and we'll see you on the next episode for part 2 of Prog in the 1990s.